My parents said I would regret walking away from this family. They were absolutely certain I would come crawling back. 3 years later, they were the ones who couldn't handle the silence. Posted to r/true off my chest. My parents are very good at predictions. They have always been very good at predictions about what choices I would regret, about what decisions would ruin my life, about which version of me was real, and which version I was merely performing for an audience that would eventually get bored and leave. They said these things with the particular confidence of people who have decided that love gives you the right to be certain about another person, even especially when that person is standing in front of you telling you something different about themselves. The prediction I want to talk about today is the one my mother made on a Tuesday evening in September, almost 4 years ago, when I was standing in the doorway of my childhood home with a bag over my shoulder and my car keys in my hand, and the very clear understanding that I was not going to walk back through that door on anyone else's terms but my own. She said, "You will regret this. You will come back here, and you will be sorry." She did not say it cruelly. That is the part that always makes the story harder to tell, because cruelty is easy to reject and easy to explain to people who are not there. She said it with what I can only describe as loving certainty, the tone of someone who believes they are protecting you from a mistake even as they are the reason you are making it. She genuinely believed she was right. She genuinely believed I would be back within the month, tail between my legs, ready to accept the terms of a relationship that had been her terms and her terms only for as long as I could remember. My father stood behind her in the hallway. He did not say anything. He rarely did, in the moments that mattered. He was the kind of man who agreed by not disagreeing, who participated by not objecting, who let my mother's certainty stand in for both of them because it was easier than having a position of his own. His silence was its own kind of message, and I heard it the way I had always heard it, as confirmation that what she said was the house position, the family verdict, the thing I was supposed to carry with me when I left. I said goodbye to both of them. I drove to my apartment. I sat in my car for a few minutes. And then I went inside and began the slow, strange, enormously difficult work of learning what my life felt like when it was organized around my own understanding of myself rather than theirs. That work is still ongoing. But the prediction that I would come crawling back, that the silence would break me before it broke them, did not hold. This is the story of how I know that. My name is Renata. I am 31 years old. I was raised in a suburb of a mid-sized city by two parents who, by any external standard, did an adequate job. We were not poor. I was not physically harmed. I went to school and had friends and participated in things, and from the outside, I am certain our family looked like a family. What it looked like from the inside is harder to summarize, so let me try to give you specific things rather than general impressions, because I have learned that general impressions, my mother was controlling, my father was passive, our family had issues, don't convey the texture of what it actually felt like to grow up inside something. Specific things do. My mother's name is Gloria. She is 58 years old, small and sharp-eyed, with the kind of energy that fills a room before she enters it. She is intelligent, genuinely intelligent, the kind that expresses itself in attention to detail and a very long memory and an ability to read people that she mostly used, in my experience, to find the pressure points. She loved me. I have no doubt she loved me. But her love was a love that required me to be a particular kind of person in order to be receivable, and the particular kind of person she needed me to be was someone who stayed within the borders she had drawn without visibly chafing at them. Here are some specific things. When I was 15, I told my mother I wanted to study art. I had been drawing and painting seriously since I was 12, spending hours in my room on pieces that my art teacher said showed real promise. My mother listened to me say this, and then said that art was a way to waste potential, and that people who studied art became people who needed to be supported by others, and that she had not raised me to be dependent. The conversation ended there, because conversations with my mother ended when she arrived at her conclusion, not when we had reached a shared one. I did not bring up art again. I went to study business administration, which she approved of, and I spent 4 years moving through a curriculum that held no interest for me, and emerged with a degree that I used for exactly 2 years before I found my way back to the work I actually cared about. I run a small design studio now. It does well. She has never asked about it in a way that acknowledged it was the thing she told me I could not do. When I was 22 and in my first serious relationship, a man named David, who was patient and perceptive and one of the better people I have known, my mother decided, within one dinner, that he was not right for me. She did not say this to my face. She said it to my aunt, who said it to my cousin, who said it to me, because that is how information moved in our family when my mother did not want to be held responsible for saying something directly. The information arrived back to me in pieces, each piece a different version of the same conclusion. David was not ambitious enough. David was not serious enough about his future. David was the kind of person you dated in your 20s and looked back on with mild embarrassment at 30. David and I broke up 8 months later, and I cannot tell you with confidence how much of that ending was us, and how much of it was the drip, drip, drip of my mother's assessment arriving secondhand over 8 months, coloring every argument and every quiet moment with the question of whether she was right. I cannot tell you, because I did not have, at 22, the clarity to see it clearly. I have it now. It does not entirely help. When I was 25, I started therapy. I did not tell my parents. When my mother found out, through a cousin again, because nothing was private in our family in ways I was still not fully understanding, she called me and said she was concerned. She said therapy was for people with serious problems, and she hoped I knew that whatever I was telling a stranger, she and my father were the people who actually knew me and could help me far better than any professional could. She said she hoped I was not being convinced of things that were not true about my family. She said she was only telling me this because she loved me. I said I appreciated her concern. I kept going to therapy. It was the best thing I had done for myself in years, and it was about to become even more important. My therapist's name is Dr. Sarah Osei. She is exactly the right kind of person for the work, quiet and rigorous and deeply unwilling to let you off the hook when you are being less than honest with yourself, which is the only kind of therapist worth having. I started seeing her when I was 25, and I have seen her, with varying frequency depending on what was happening in my life, ever since. It took me about a year of sessions with Sarah before I could say clearly, and without immediately qualifying it, my mother's love is conditional. Not in a dramatic or categorical way. Not in the way of a villain in a story. But conditional in the specific way of a love that comes with a running assessment, a perpetual evaluation of whether I am the version of myself she requires, and a set of consequences: withdrawal, criticism transmitted secondhand, the specific chill of her disapproval for being something other than that. Sarah did not tell me what to do with this understanding. She never does. She asked me what I wanted to do with it. And the answer, which came slowly and then all at once, was that I wanted to stop organizing my life around managing it. The decision to step back from my parents did not happen in a single moment. It built over about 18 months of growing clarity, of noticing the way a visit home left me with a particular heaviness for days afterward, of noticing how often I edited myself before calling my mother to avoid the conversations I did not have the energy for, of noticing that I was managing a relationship rather than having one. I set some gentle limits first. I said I could not make the Christmas trip one year because I had work obligations, which was true, but also because I needed a year where December did not feel like something I had to survive. My mother received this with a silence that communicated, precisely and thoroughly, her disapproval. She did not say anything directly. She did not need to. The silence was its own statement. The specific evening, the Tuesday in September, the doorway, the bag, was the result of a dinner that I will not recreate in full detail because it is less important as a scene than as a culmination. What happened was not a single dramatic act of cruelty. What happened was a conversation in which my mother said a number of things she had said before, in configurations I recognized, about choices I was making and the ways they disappointed her, and something in me that had been holding on to the possibility of a different outcome simply finished. Not in anger, in exhaustion. In the very clear recognition that I was 30 years old, and I was sitting at this table feeling like I was 17, and nothing was going to change this dinner, or the next one or the one after that unless I changed something. I said I needed some space. I said I loved them, and I was not going away forever, but I needed to not be here for a while. My mother's face did its particular thing, not quite anger, not quite hurt, the expression that is always meant, "You are making a mistake, and I am already processing my disappointment in it." My father looked at the table. I said goodbye to both of them. I picked up my bag. I walked to the door. And then came the prediction. You will regret this. You will come back here, and you will be sorry. I drove home, and the silence began. I want to talk about what the silence was like because people sometimes imagine that cutting contact, or even significantly limiting it, which is what I did in the beginning before it became the fuller absence it turned into, is a relief. A clean break. Something that feels like putting down a weight. It is partly that. But it is also a grief. The grief was strange and nonlinear and sometimes arrived at unexpected hours for unexpected reasons. I would drive past a restaurant we used to go to as a family and feel something complicated that was not quite sadness and not quite anger, and was mostly just the weight of what was not. I would have a good week, something genuinely good, and reach for my phone to call someone and feel the absence of the call I was not making. I would see mothers and daughters together in ordinary settings, a grocery store, a coffee shop, a street corner, and feel the particular longing of someone who wants something they cannot have in the form they want it. Sarah helped me understand that this grief was not evidence I had made a wrong choice. She said that you can grieve something genuinely harmful. She said that longing for a different version of a parent is not the same as longing to return to the one you actually had. She said the grief was appropriate, and that sitting with it rather than running from it or using it as evidence against myself was the work. I sat with it. It was as unpleasant as she said it would be. It was also slowly clarifying. For the first 6 months of the silence, my parents did not reach out. I want to be honest about this because it surprised me and also because it mattered. My mother had said I would come crawling back, which implied she was prepared to wait. And she waited. My father, as was his way, waited alongside her without a position of his own. I received no calls, no messages, no secondhand information through cousins. Just silence. I told myself this was fine. Some days I believed it. Other days I sat in my apartment and thought about my mother's certainty. You will come back. You will be sorry. And wondered whether I was simply engaged in a waiting game that she was more equipped to win than I was. What I did not do was reach out. Not because I was being stubborn or not only because of that, but because Sarah and I had talked about what I actually needed before any contact made sense, and what I needed was to experience myself outside the field of my parents' assessment for long enough to understand what I was actually like when no one was measuring. I needed to know my own shape, without the outline they had drawn for me. I spent that first year doing things that were mine. I focused on my design work, which was growing in ways that felt genuinely exciting. I spent more time with friends, real time, present time, the kind of time I had sometimes shortchanged because family logistics consumed so much of my bandwidth. I traveled alone for the first time, a 2-week trip to Portugal and Spain that I had talked about doing for years and never done, and which turned out to be one of the more significant experiences of my adult life. Not because travel is magic, but because I spent 2 weeks entirely in my own company, making decisions without consulting anyone else's preferences, and discovered that I was, unexpectedly, and somewhat to my own surprise, good company. I called my aunt occasionally, my father's sister, who exists at the periphery of my parents' world without being consumed by it, and who has always been a more honest voice than most of my family. She told me, without elaborating, that my parents were finding the quiet difficult. She did not say more than that. I thanked her and did not ask for more. The first crack came at month 7. My father called. Not my mother, my father, which was itself unusual enough that I sat looking at his name on my screen for a moment before I answered. He sounded careful in the way of someone who has been thinking about what to say and is worried about saying it wrong. He said he hoped I was well. I said I was well. He said he missed me. I said I missed him too, which was true, uncomplicated true, because my father's passivity had been harmful in its own way, but I missed him differently than I missed the idea of my mother, more straightforwardly, with fewer layers. We talked for about 20 minutes. He did not bring up the silence, or my mother's prediction, or anything that had happened at the dinner. He talked about ordinary things, his garden, a book he was reading, a trip he and my mother had taken. I let him. At the end, he said he hoped we could talk again soon. I said I would like that. I meant it. He called again, 3 weeks later. And again after that. These calls were never long and never deep, but they were consistent, and something in them told me that my father was doing something he had rarely done in my life, He was showing up on his own, without my mother's orchestration, because he wanted to. I have thought about what that means. I have not fully resolved it. My father's absence during the years of my growing up was real, and it caused its own kind of harm. But he was also, I have come to understand, a man who had spent 30 years inside my mother's certainty and who had, in some ways, lost access to his own agency in the same way he had prevented me from accessing mine. The therapy work I was doing was for me. But watching my father start to move on his own, haltingly and late and imperfectly, was something I observed with more compassion than I expected to. My mother's first contact came at month 11. Not a call. A letter. An actual, physical, handwritten letter, which arrived in my mailbox on a Wednesday morning and which I held in my hands for about 5 minutes before opening it, partly because I was surprised by the format and partly because I was preparing myself for whatever it contained. I have read this letter many times. I will not reproduce it in full, but I will tell you what it was. It was not an apology, exactly. It was something more complicated, a letter from a woman who was trying, within the considerable limits of her self-understanding, to say something honest. She said that she had been thinking. She said the silence had given her time to think, which was itself a striking admission from someone who had predicted I would break before she did. She said she had been talking to someone. She did not use the word therapist, she said someone, and I respected the privacy of that while understanding what it meant. She said she knew that she had not always made it easy for me to be in relationship with her. She said she loved me in a way that did not always feel like love to me, and she was beginning to understand why. She did not say she was wrong about the art. She did not say she was wrong about David. She did not walk back the prediction. But she said something at the end of the letter that I found unexpectedly and quietly devastating, in the specific way that things are devastating when they contain more truth than the person writing them fully understands. She said, "The silence has been harder than I expected. I thought I knew you, and I think I am realizing I know the version of you that I raised, and not the person you have become, and I am not sure how to close that distance, but I would like to try." I read that sentence 4 times. The version of you that I raised, and not the person you have become. She had written the whole story in one sentence, probably, without fully realizing she had done it. The version she had built and managed and predicted, that was the person she expected to come crawling back. The person I had become in the years since I started therapy and took the Portugal trip and built the design studio and sat in the silence long enough to hear my own voice, that person she did not know because I had never been allowed to fully be her in my mother's presence. I wrote back. Not immediately. I sat with the letter for 2 weeks and talked through it with Sarah and wrote 3 drafts before I sent the final one. I said I had received her letter and that it had meant something to me. I said I was open to the distance closing, slowly, on terms we worked out together rather than terms handed down from one direction. I said I was not ready to return to what things had been, but that I was willing to see if there was something different available to us. She wrote back within the week. The correspondence continued. I want to be careful here about what the correspondence has and has not been because I think people reading stories like this sometimes want a particular ending, and the ending I have is not that one. My mother and I have been in a gradual, careful, imperfect process of rebuilding something for the past 2 years. It is not the relationship I always wanted. It is not warm and easy in the way that some mothers and daughters seem to have it. There are things she still says that land wrong, patterns that are old and deep, and that do not evaporate because both of us are trying. There are visits, careful, shorter than they used to be, with an exit strategy one maintain for myself and deploy when I need to, and some of them are genuinely good, and some of them leave me with the old heaviness and I call Sarah afterward and we process it. But here is what is different. She is trying. Imperfectly, in the way of a woman who is learning something at 58 that is harder to learn at 58 than it would have been at 35, but genuinely and consistently trying. She has asked me about the design studio with real curiosity, not the performative interest of someone going through motions, but actual questions about how it works and what I find meaningful about it. She asked about David once, years later, and said she thought she had handled that badly and she was sorry. She did not fully understand what she had done or how the second-hand transmission had worked, but she was sorry, and she said it to my face, and I received it. She has not repeated the prediction. I do not think she could, honestly, because the prediction was based on a version of me that no longer exists and on a certainty about what I needed that 3 years of silence taught her was misplaced. She learned something in the silence. I have to believe that, because the alternative, that nothing changes, that people are fixed and closed, and the only possible outcome is estrangement permanent and complete, is not something I am able to hold as the final shape of things. My father and I have developed something that surprises me still. He calls on Sundays. We talk about his garden and my work and the book he is reading, and occasionally, slowly, we talk about harder things, about what it was like to grow up in our house and what he wishes he had done differently. He does not have the language for this in an easy way. He stumbles through it. But he shows up for the conversation every time I open it, which is more than I could have expected from the man who stood silent in the hallway. The twist in this story, the thing I said in the title, that they were the ones who couldn't handle the silence, is not a victory.
I want to be precise about that.
It is not a triumph. It is not proof that I was right, and they were wrong in some way that vindicates me. It is something quieter and more complicated. The silence broke them in the sense that it interrupted something they had believed was fixed. My mother had believed she knew me completely, in the closed and certain way that requires no new information because the subject has been fully catalogued. The silence forced her to reckon with the possibility that she did not. And in the space of that reckoning, something in her began to move that had not moved before. The silence broke the pattern. I did not come crawling back. I did not return to the doorway and the dinner table and the certainty on her face, and accept the terms she had always set. I did the hardest thing, which was to stay away long enough for something to change, and to do the work on my own side of the distance that meant that when I came back, on my own terms, slowly, carefully, maintaining my own shape, I came back as the person I had become rather than the person I had been. That is not a neat ending. It is not a story where the parents are defeated or the child is vindicated or everyone gathers around a table and agrees that the past is behind them. It is the story of 3 people learning, painfully and late, how to be in relationship with each other, without one of them losing herself in the process. It is still being written. But I am the one writing it now, not her. That, more than anything else, is the thing my mother did not predict. Update. Posted 8 months after the original post. I did not plan to come back here. I wrote the original post on a Sunday afternoon in the particular mood that sometimes descends on me when I have been doing good work on something internally and want to mark it somewhere outside my own head, and I posted it and went for a long walk and mostly forgot about it until the responses started coming in. Thank you for those. There were a lot of them, and they ran in directions I did not expect, and I read every one. A few things have happened in the 8 months since that I want to add because they belong to the story and because I think some of you will want to know. My mother started therapy. I mean properly, not the unnamed someone from the letter, but a full commitment to a therapist she sees weekly, which she told me about on the phone in a way that was clearly difficult for her to say. She said she had been resistant to it for a long time because she had believed that people who needed therapy had problems they had created for themselves, and she was beginning to understand that belief had been both incorrect and self-protective in a way that had cost her. She said her therapist was helping her understand things about how she loved that she found uncomfortable to know. I said I was glad she was doing it. I meant it, simply and without complicated feelings underneath, which itself felt like a form of progress. The design studio had its best quarter since I started it. I hired my first part-time employee, a young woman named Freya, who is 24 and enormously talented, and who reminds me of the person I was at 24 when I was studying business administration and feeling like I had walked into the wrong room of my own life. I told her once that she should trust her instincts about her work. She said her parents had always told her to be practical. I said I understood that, and that practical and purposeful were not mutually exclusive, and that the trick was figuring out which advice was actually about you, and which advice was about the person giving it. She thought about that for a minute and then laughed and said that was probably the most useful thing anyone had said to her in months. I went to my parents' house for dinner last month. It was my mother's birthday.
I want to tell you how it was.
It was not perfect. There was a moment, maybe 40 minutes in, when my mother said something about a choice I was making that had the old shape to it, the assessing quality, the implication that she could see something I couldn't, and I felt the old response come up in my chest, the contraction, the familiar calibration between fighting and disappearing. I excused myself briefly, stood in their bathroom, took 3 full breaths, and came back. But I also want to tell you the other thing that happened because it belongs in the story as much as the difficult moment does. After dinner, when my father had gone to do something in the garden and my mother and I were sitting at the kitchen table with our tea, she looked at me for a moment and said, "I'm glad you came." Not gladder than expected. Not glad despite everything. Just, "I'm glad you came." Simple. Present. Addressed to the version of me sitting at her table rather than the version she had catalogued and predicted and been sure she understood. I said I was glad too. We sat in the kitchen for another hour, just the two of us, talking about things, some light, some not, some in the tentative way of people who are building something and are not entirely sure of the architecture yet, but who are committed to the building. She asked about a project I was working on, and she listened to the whole answer. She told me something about herself that she had never told me before, about her own mother and the way she had been raised that she had never examined, and how she thought some of those patterns had become her own before she understood what she was carrying. It was the first conversation of that kind we have ever had. I do not know how many more we will have, or what shape the next ones will take. I only know that it happened at her kitchen table, 8 months after I posted a story about a prediction that did not come true. She was sure I would be the one who couldn't hold the silence. She was sure she knew me well enough to know that. She was wrong about that, and in being wrong about it, she learned something that is making her a different mother than the one I walked away from, not unrecognizable, not transformed, not cleansed of everything that made those years hard, but different.
Still emotion.
Still becoming something. That, I think, is the whole truth of it. I want to close with something I have said to a few people privately since posting this, because I think it is the most honest summary I have. Walking away was not the dramatic act of strength it might look like from the outside. It was terrifying and it was lonely, and it was full of the particular grief of missing people who are still alive, which is one of the stranger human experiences. I did not do it because I was brave. I did it because I had run out of other options, and because Sarah helped me understand that staying in something that was hurting me was not the same as loyalty, and that protecting myself was not the same as abandonment. And then the silence did what silence sometimes does, which is to create a space where something can change. Not always. I know it does not always. I know there are people who walked away from their parents and who the silence calcified rather than opened, and who made peace with a permanent distance because that was the only version available to them, and that peace is valid and hard one, and I honor it. But in my case, the silence softened something in her. The silence showed her a daughter she did not know, not because I had been hiding, but because she had not been looking. And what she found, when she finally looked, was a person she did not have a pre-drawn outline for. A person she had to actually see. She is still learning how to see me. I am still learning how to be seen by her without bracing. We are, both of us, learning something that should have been learned a long time ago. It is late. It is imperfect. It is mine.